The morning of 29 May 1940 breaks gray and cold over the English Channel. Off the coast of Dunkirk, the water churns with the remnants of the British Expeditionary Force soldiers wading through the shallows, small boats crowded with men, the air thick with smoke, and the acrid smell of burning oil. The evacuation operation codenamed Dynamo is at its most desperate, its most crucial. And it is here, in these shallow waters, where the Royal Navy operates with advantage, that the German Navy's limitations become starkly, irreversibly apparent. A German destroyer detachment approaches, intent on disrupting this operation that will save over 300,000 troops. What unfolds is not a German triumph, but a revelation of why the Kriegsmarine never truly threatened British naval supremacy despite years of construction and millions in resources devoted to building a fleet to challenge the world's foremost naval power. This story is not simply about ships and guns, though both matter enormously. It is about the fundamental strategic miscalculation that shaped the German war effort from its very inception, about technological ambition outrunning practical capability, and about how Britain's destroyer forces, smaller, older, often less impressive on paper than their German counterparts, maintained an unshakable grip on the waters surrounding the British Isles. By the end of this examination, you will understand why the Kriegsmarine, for all its formidable construction and evident capability, proved unable to dislodge the Royal Navy from its position of dominance. The answer lies not in any single weapon or innovation, but in the accumulated weight of industrial capacity, strategic foresight, and sheer numerical superiority that Britain had built across decades of naval supremacy. The root of Germany's naval failure reaches back to the end of the First World War, to decisions made in the halls of Whitehall and the offices of Berlin. When the Treaty of Versailles was imposed upon Germany in 1919, it imposed strict limitations on the size and composition of the Kriegsmarine. Germany was permitted a fleet of no more than 100,000 tons displacement, roughly equivalent to what a single modern battleship might weigh. By comparison, Britain's naval power at the same moment comprised hundreds of warships, including dozens of capital ships accumulated across centuries of maritime dominance. Germany's situation was not merely one of disadvantage. It was one of fundamental impossibility. To build a navy that could rival Britain required not merely the commitment of resources, but the overturning of international treaties and the willingness to provoke a naval arms race at a moment when Germany's economy was already fractured by reparations and hyperinflation. Yet the German naval establishment pursued this seemingly impossible task with characteristic determination. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, in the face of constraints that would have crippled lesser programs, German engineers and shipwrights developed innovative designs intended to maximize capability within artificial limitations. The Deutschland-class pocket battleships became the symbol of this ambition. Warships that attempted to pack the firepower of a capital ship into a hull small enough to comply with treaty restrictions. These vessels were genuinely impressive achievements in naval architecture, and their appearance in the South Atlantic during the opening months of war sent shivers through Allied shipping circles. Yet, they also represented something more fundamental, a strategic gamble that Germany could win a naval war not through overwhelming numerical superiority, but through technological brilliance and tactical innovation. The problem with this philosophy became apparent as war progressed and expanded. Germany needed a fleet large enough to challenge British naval superiority, yet the industrial base that had been painstakingly rebuilt after Versailles proved entirely inadequate to the task. Britain, by contrast, approached the war with a fleet already numbering in the hundreds and with shipyards capable of producing new vessels at a rate that German yards, hampered by resource shortages and strategic bombing, could never match. In 1939, when war commenced, Britain possessed over 100 destroyers in service or completing. Germany possessed 34, and despite years of accelerated construction, this disparity never narrowed. The German Navy was outnumbered, not by a factor of 2 or 3, but by a ratio that rendered all tactical brilliance ultimately irrelevant. Numbers, the ruthless arithmetic of industrial capacity, proved decisive where ingenuity could not. The destroyer forces of both nations became the instruments through which this mathematical reality played out. Destroyers were not the glamorous capital ships that captured public imagination, yet they were absolutely essential to the conduct of modern naval warfare. These were the vessels that screened capital ships, that hunted submarines, that conducted escort duties protecting merchant convoys, and that engaged enemy warships when battle fleets collided. The Germans invested considerable effort in destroyer design, producing vessels such as the Type 1936, with specifications that appeared competitive when studied in isolation, armed with 5 12.7 centimeter guns, capable of speeds exceeding 36 knots, and equipped with modern fire control systems. These were professional warships, capably designed and efficiently constructed. The British destroyer force, by contrast, was aging and heterogeneous. Many vessels dated from the First World War, their designs representing lessons learned in 1916 and 1917 rather than contemporary thinking. The British flotillas included pre-dreadnought-era destroyers alongside modern specimens, vessels of radically different sizes and capabilities, ships that had been modified and adapted across 2 decades of continuous service. On paper, comparing a British V-class destroyer from 1918 with a German Type 1936 from 1938 would suggest a clear German advantage. Yet this comparison captures nothing of the actual distribution of power in the Channel and the North Sea during the war years. Britain's strength lay not in the specification of individual vessels, but in the sheer accumulation of destroyers across every theater of war. When the German Navy sought to contest British naval dominance in home waters, it confronted not a handful of enemy destroyers, but flotillas and divisions, supported by cruisers, backed by capital ships, and reinforced by continuous replacement and repair. The British Navy could afford losses that would have been catastrophic to the Kriegsmarine. When a British destroyer was sunk, another was constructed or transferred from service elsewhere. When a German destroyer was lost, the loss represented a significantly larger percentage of the available force. This became evident immediately when Germany attempted to interdict the Dunkirk evacuation. The destroyer SMSMW, a modern vessel by any standard, was sent along with torpedo boats to disrupt the evacuation operation. What she encountered was not a single British destroyer to be matched against her own armament, but coordinated British naval forces that brought overwhelming firepower to bear. The MW was engaged by multiple British vessels simultaneously, a situation that no amount of superior individual armament could overcome. She was damaged, forced to withdraw, and the German attempt to disrupt dynamo failed. Similar patterns repeated throughout 1940 and 1941 as the Kriegsmarine sought to contest British superiority in home waters. The Norwegian campaign of April 1940 provided another instructive example. German destroyers and cruisers achieved tactical successes, sinking British vessels and inflicting casualties. Yet the ultimate outcome was never in question. German naval losses accumulated, replacement capacity proved inadequate, and British vessels, though they suffered losses of their own, could be made good through a combination of new construction and transfer from other commands. By the summer of 1940, the German Navy had expended a substantial percentage of its destroyer strength without fundamentally altering the strategic picture. British naval dominance in home waters remained intact, and German capacity for further major naval operations was severely constrained. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It allows us to continue producing documentaries that explore the hidden technical and strategic stories behind history's greatest conflicts. The comparison with American destroyer forces illuminates the broader pattern further still. American destroyers, produced in staggering numbers as American shipyards ramped up for war, were not necessarily superior to German designs in every particular. The American Fletcher class, for instance, represented a careful compromise between armament, speed, and seaworthiness, rather than a revolutionary design. Yet by 1943, American yards were producing destroyers at a rate that rendered obsolescence a curiosity rather than a concern. When an American destroyer was lost, 3 more were under construction to replace her. This abundance of means shaped naval strategy profoundly. The Allies could afford to risk ships in operations where the Germans could only observe and withdraw. German attempts to offset numerical disadvantage through technological innovation produced some genuinely noteworthy designs. The Type 1936, a destroyer, represented an evolution in armament and armor protection that was impressive by contemporary standards. Yet these advantages mattered less and less as the war progressed, and the numerical gap widened inexorably. A superior destroyer, when confronted by 3 inferior destroyers operating in coordination, becomes tactically irrelevant. The German Navy never adequately grasped this fundamental truth, or, more accurately, grasped it, but found themselves unable to address it through any means within their control. The submarine arm of the Kriegsmarine received far greater resources and strategic emphasis than destroyer forces, reflecting Hitler's determination to wage commerce warfare against Britain. This decision, though understandable from a strategic perspective, further depleted resources available for conventional destroyer production. The U-boat campaign achieved remarkable successes in 1942 and early 1943, sinking millions of tons of merchant shipping. Yet this very success prompted a reinforced Allied emphasis on anti-submarine warfare, driving destroyer construction rates even higher as the need for escort vessels became overwhelmingly clear. Germany's strategic choices thus inadvertently accelerated the widening of the gap between Allied and Axis destroyer strengths. The historical impact of German naval failure extended far beyond the immediately quantifiable measures of ships sunk or battles won. The inability of the Kriegsmarine to challenge British naval dominance meant that Britain retained the capacity to reinforce colonial garrisons, to transport troops across oceans, and to maintain supply lines connecting the island nation to its global empire and its allies. This capacity proved absolutely essential when America entered the war and when the decision was made to invade Normandy in 1944. The maintenance of naval superiority in home waters did not, in itself, defeat Nazi Germany. Yet without it, the eventual defeat would have been delayed indefinitely and might never have occurred at all. The survival of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk would have been rendered impossible had German destroyers successfully disrupted the evacuation operation. The subsequent fight against Nazi Germany would have taken a dramatically different form. Survivors of the war years offered testimony to the prevailing psychology among German naval personnel regarding British dominance. Officers and men of the Kriegsmarine operated throughout the war with the clear understanding that they were outnumbered at every level and that their opportunities to engage British naval forces would be constrained by the requirement to avoid situations where they might be overwhelmed. This was not defeatism, but rather a clear-eyed appreciation of strategic reality. The German Navy never achieved the capacity to fight the kind of fleet engagement that might have fundamentally altered the distribution of power in European waters. Consequently, they were reduced to commerce raiding, to defending against invasion threat, to operating within strictly limited parameters. The psychological weight of this constraint cannot be overstated. The conclusion to this story returns us to those gray waters off Dunkirk in the late spring of 1940, but with new understanding. The German destroyers that approached the evacuation operation did so not because Germany possessed superior naval capability in absolute terms, but because Hitler's gamble that Britain would sue for peace after the fall of France seemed plausible. The Royal Navy's demonstrated capacity to repel German intrusions was not the product of superior vessel design or innovative tactical thinking. It was the direct consequence of accumulated advantage in numbers, of industrial capacity that could sustain losses and continue production, of the legacy of naval dominance built across centuries of maritime power. The German Navy failed against British destroyers, not because individual German officers were less competent or their vessels less capably constructed, but because no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome the simple arithmetic of being outnumbered by a factor of 3 or more. This was the ultimate lesson of German naval strategy in the Second World War. Germany attempted to fight a naval war against a nation that had already fought and won the industrial competition before the first shots were fired. In the decades following Versailles, while German engineers designed innovative vessels to maximize capability within treaty constraints, Britain had quietly maintained and expanded a fleet already numbering in the hundreds. Britain had ensured that its shipyards remained capable of replacing losses. Britain had built a navy not for elegance of design, but for overwhelming abundance. When war came, this abundance proved decisive. The German Navy was defeated not in any single moment of dramatic confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of disadvantage that no innovation could overcome and no tactical brilliance could circumvent. It was a defeat written not in the specifications of individual vessels, but in the iron logic of industrial production and numerical strength. And it was a defeat that, more than any other single factor, guaranteed that Britain would endure, would resist, and would ultimately prove among the architects of Nazi Germany's destruction.